Name the only American general in World War II who made 4 combat jumps. Not 2, not 3, 4. The man who was first out the airplane door every single time, who carried an enlisted man's M1 Garand rifle instead of the officer's carbine, because he refused to be anything other than one of his own troops, who built his division's airborne doctrine from nothing, wrote the Army's first field manual on parachute warfare, and then jumped into combat to prove every word of it. You cannot name him. Almost nobody can, because when people talk about the airborne in World War II, they talk about Bastogne, they talk about Band of Brothers, they talk about the 101st, and they skip right past the man who did it first, did it more and did it longer than anyone else in the European theater. His name was James Gavin. He took command of the 82nd Airborne Division at 37 years old, the youngest American to command a division since George Armstrong Custer. And over 422 days of combat across 7 campaigns, from Sicily to Berlin, his division never gave back a single foot of ground it took, not once. This is the story of how a nameless orphan from a Pennsylvania coal town built the most feared unit in Europe from scratch. To understand how a 37-year-old ended up commanding an entire airborne division in the middle of the biggest war in human history, you have to start with where he came from, which is, essentially, nowhere. James Gavin was born on March 22, 1907, in Brooklyn, New York. His birth certificate reads James Nally Ryan, with the middle name crossed out. His mother was likely an Irish immigrant named Catherine Ryan. His father may have been a man named James Nally, though the records are deliberately vague. Both parents either died or gave him up before he turned 2. By 1909, he was living in the Convent of Mercy Orphanage in Brooklyn, a baby with no name anyone intended to keep. That same year, Martin and Mary Gavin, a working-class Irish immigrant couple in Mount Carmel, Pennsylvania, deep in the anthracite coal country, adopted him. Martin Gavin was a coal miner who could barely read or write. The household was not gentle. At least one biographer describes Mary as an abusive alcoholic and Martin as passive. Gavin later said of them, diplomatically, that his parents were kind people who could hardly read or write. He never spoke about them in detail. He never went back. By 10 years old, Gavin was delivering newspapers. By 11, he held 2 routes and served as agent for 3 out-of-town papers, devouring the World War I headlines he carried. He became obsessed with the Civil War, specifically with how commanders could control the movements of thousands of men across vast distances. He left school after the 8th grade and worked full-time, first as a shoe store clerk earning $12.50 a week, then briefly managing for Jewel Oil Company. He was terrified of only one future, becoming a coal miner like his father, going underground, staying there until the mine took him. On March 22, 1924, his 17th birthday, Gavin ran away from home. He took the night train to New York City. His first act was to send a telegram to his adoptive parents, assuring them he was alive. At the recruiting station, he was underage and needed parental consent. His solution was characteristically direct. He told the recruiter he was an orphan. The recruiter gathered the underage orphan boys together, took them to a lawyer who declared himself their legal guardian, and signed consent papers. On April 1, 1924, James Gavin raised his right hand at the Whitehall building in Manhattan and became a private in the United States Army. He later recalled simply that he could not wait to join up. He shipped to Fort Sherman in the Panama Canal Zone, assigned to a 155mm Coast artillery crew. A first sergeant named Chief Williams, a Native American, recognized his potential and made Gavin his assistant. On Williams' advice, Gavin applied to Army prep school at Corozal, where a lieutenant named Percy Black tutored him in algebra, geometry, English, and history, subjects he had never properly studied. Gavin passed the West Point entrance exams and arrived at the academy in the summer of 1925. Just 14 months after enlisting, 3 months past his 18th birthday. On his application, he claimed to be 21 to conceal his underage enlistment. If you are finding this valuable, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm this kind of deep research is worth showing to more people. Now, back to Gavin. He graduated in the class of 1929, 185th out of 299. A mid-pack finish that conceals extraordinary effort. He rose at 4:30 every morning to study in the bathroom, the only room with enough light, compensating for years of missed formal education. Notable classmates included Frank Merrill, later of Merrill's Marauders fame, and Paul Harkins, later a 4-star general in Vietnam. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant of infantry on June 12, 1929, and married Irma Balsier 3 months later. Here is where the story shifts. What happened next should have taken 20 years of a normal Army career. Gavin compressed it into 12. His pre-war assignments read like a graduate seminar in 20th century warfare. At Fort Benning Infantry School, he studied under George Marshall, then the commandant, and Joseph Stilwell, head of the tactics department. Stilwell taught him a principle he never abandoned. Anything you ask the troops to do, you must be able to do yourself. Under Leslie McNair at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, he devoured the writings of J.F.C. Fuller on armor, air power, and mobility. In the Philippines, he grew alarmed at American unpreparedness. He wrote that their weapons and equipment were no better than those used in World War I. But the real turning point came in 1939, when he was assigned to the West Point Tactics faculty and tasked with analyzing the German Blitzkrieg. He studied the Fallschirmjäger, the German paratroopers, at Eben Emael in Norway and on Crete. He devoured everything he could find on Soviet parachute experiments from the 1930s, and he became convinced that airborne forces combined with tactical mobility represented the future of warfare, not just dropping men from the sky, redesigning how armies used the men after they landed. In August 1941, Gavin volunteered for parachute school at Fort Benning. He was 34 years old. Most officers his age were angling for safe staff positions as the Army expanded toward 1 million men. Gavin wanted to jump out of airplanes. He completed the 3-week course, made his 5 qualifying jumps, and immediately took command of C Company in the 503rd Parachute Infantry Battalion, one of the earliest American parachute units in existence. There were fewer than 5,000 paratroopers in the entire United States Army at that point. The concept was still considered experimental by most of the senior leadership. Many generals openly argued that airborne operations were a waste of resources. The Germans had proven at Crete that paratroopers suffered catastrophic casualties in the drop phase and could never carry enough heavy weapons to fight conventional armor on the ground. Gavin disagreed. He'd studied Crete more carefully than the skeptics. He believed the problem was not the concept, but the execution. The Germans had dropped men piecemeal without coordination into the teeth of prepared defenses. If you dropped a concentrated force behind enemy lines at night, at key terrain, with clear objectives and aggressive leadership on the ground, you could paralyze an enemy's rear area while conventional forces hit from the front. The key was speed and violence. Get on the ground, seize the objective, hold until relieved, and never, under any circumstances, give it back. Colonel William C. Lee, known as the Father of the Airborne, recognized a kindred spirit. He made Gavin his operations and training officer for the Provisional Airborne Group. On October 16, 1941, Gavin was promoted to major at age 34. And then Gavin did something that defined the rest of his life. He wrote Field Manual 31-30, Tactics and Technique of Airborne Troops, the United States Army's first field manual on airborne warfare. He synthesized Soviet drop experiments, German combat experience from Crete and the Low Countries, and his own tactical thinking into the document that would govern how America fought from the sky. When later asked what made his career take off so fast, his answer was blunt. I wrote the book. I think this detail matters more than most people realize. Plenty of officers volunteered for the airborne. Plenty were brave. Gavin was different because he was an intellectual and a fighter simultaneously. He did not just want to jump out of airplanes. He wanted to redesign the entire concept of vertical envelopment. That combination, the thinker who also carries a rifle, is vanishingly rare in any military, in any era. The 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment was activated on July 6, 1942, at Fort Benning. Gavin assumed command in August at age 35. He was promoted to temporary colonel in September, and he built the regiment from nothing. His rules were absolute and non-negotiable. Officers will be first out of the airplane door and last in the chow line. Officers carried the M1 Garand, the standard enlisted weapon, not the lighter M1 carbine issued to most officers elsewhere in the Army. The symbolism was deliberate. If you command paratroopers, you are a paratrooper. His final training test was a 50-mile forced march in 36 hours, marching all night, maneuvering all day, seizing and defending an airhead, sleeping for 1 hour, then resuming the march, all carrying full combat loads on reserve rations. Chief of Staff Doc Eaton described the result. They were awesome. Every man a clone of the CO, Gavin. Tough. Not just in the field, but 24 hours a day. Off duty, they would move into a bar in little groups, and if everyone there did not get down on their knees in adoration, they would simply tear the place up. Airborne service was entirely volunteer. Paratroopers received hazardous duty pay, $50 a month extra for enlisted men, and $100 for officers. Glider troops, who were arguably in more danger because they had no parachutes and rode wooden aircraft into crash landings, received nothing extra. The 3-week jump school at Fort Benning consisted of Ground Week, Tower Week featuring the famous 250-foot free towers acquired from the 1939 World's Fair, and Jump Week with 5 qualifying static line jumps from C-47s at 1,200 feet. Physical requirements were extreme. Troops had to be alert, active, and supple with firm muscles and sound limbs. Selection was self-selecting in the most brutal way. Those who could not keep up washed out on forced marches, obstacle courses, close quarters combat, knife fighting, and night operations. Training casualties were real. Practice jumps on hard ground caused frequent broken legs and ankles. When the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment made a practice jump in 30-mile-per-hour winds in North Africa, nearly 30% of the regiment ended up in the hospital. The 505th joined the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg in February 1943. They departed New York Harbor on April 29th and reached Casablanca on May 10th. 2 months later, the 505th would make the first regimental-sized combat parachute assault in American military history. And that brings us to Sicily, where everything Gavin had built was tested for the first time. On the night of July 9th, 1943, Colonel Gavin, age 36, led the 505th Parachute Regimental Combat Team, 3,400 men aboard 226 C-47 transports, towards southeastern Sicily in Operation Husky. Their mission was to seize strategic crossroads behind enemy lines north of Gela, blocking Axis reinforcements from reaching the invasion beaches. The drop was a catastrophe. Winds of 35 miles per hour, more than double the safe training limit, combined with inexperienced troop carrier pilots who had never flown a combat mission to scatter paratroopers across 60 miles of southeastern Sicily. Some men landed 25 miles from the intended drop zone. Others came down in the sea and drowned. Gavin himself could not determine whether he had landed in Sicily, Italy, or the Balkans until he spotted distant shell fire and oriented himself. He assembled an initial group of fewer than 20 men and did what he would do for the rest of the war. He marched toward the sound of the guns. But here is what the Germans did not understand. Despite the chaos, and likely because of it, small paratrooper groups operating independently behind enemy lines, cutting telephone wires, ambushing convoys, establishing roadblocks at crossroads, were so effective at creating confusion that German commanders estimated the airborne force at 10 times its actual strength. 3,400 scattered paratroopers were mistaken for a force of 30,000. The next night brought the worst friendly fire incident in American military history to that point. 144 C-47 transports carrying Colonel Reuben Tucker's 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment flew over the beachhead on a reinforcement mission. A nervous gunner aboard a naval vessel, never identified, opened fire on the formation. Within seconds, the panic spread. Virtually every Allied naval vessel and ground unit along the coast joined in, pouring anti-aircraft fire into their own transports. 23 C-47s were shot down. 37 more were heavily damaged. The combined toll was 318 killed, wounded, and missing, including 81 paratroopers killed and 132 wounded, from the 504th alone, plus dozens of aircrew. Brigadier General Charles Kearns, Jr., the 82nd's Assistant Division Commander, was aboard a plane lost at sea and never found. Tucker's own aircraft flew the length of the Sicilian coast twice, with more than 2,000 holes in its fuselage. By morning, only 400 of the 504th's 1,600 paratroopers had reached the objective area. That disaster led directly to the painted invasion stripes on Allied aircraft for D-Day and entirely new anti-aircraft fire protocols. And then it got worse. Or rather, it got intensely personal for Gavin. On July 11th, 1943, Gavin faced his first real test as a combat leader, Piazza Ridge. This was the action that made his reputation, and I believe it is the single most important moment in his entire career. Piazza Ridge was a strategic 100-foot elevation overlooking the road between German armor concentrations and the vulnerable 1st and 45th Infantry Division beachheads at Gela. If the Germans held it, their panzers had a clear path to push the invasion back into the sea. Gavin arrived with a platoon of 3 07th Combat Engineers and attacked the ridge. Throughout the day, he assembled a scratch force from mixed units, regimental clerks, cooks, truck drivers, signalmen, everyone who could carry a weapon. Eventually, several hundred men, they faced the entire Eastern Task Force of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division, at least 700 Luftwaffe infantry, an armored artillery battalion, and a company of 17 Tiger I heavy tanks, each mounting an 88mm cannon. Gavin had no tanks, no tank destroyers, no artillery support, and no communication with the beachhead. His men captured 2 75mm pack howitzers and used them as direct-fire anti-tank weapons, aiming at the vulnerable underbellies of Tiger tanks as they reared up crossing a stone wall. One Tiger was knocked out this way. His order to his men was simple and absolute. We are staying on this goddamned ridge no matter what happens. He later compared the situation mentally to Grant at Shiloh, sheltered under the riverbank, his command overrun, refusing to leave the field. A trooper named Harold Eatman found Gavin in a shallow hole scraped into the shale, out in front of the entire position. When Eatman gasped for water, Gavin offered his own canteen. "Here, son, take some of mine." By evening, 6 M4 Sherman tanks finally arrived from the 45th Infantry Division. At 8:30 that night, Gavin ordered a counterattack. The Hermann Göring Division retreated. According to the official Army history published by the Center of Military History, the paratroop stand at Piazza Ridge prompted the German commander Conrath to change his plans, pulling forces away from the 1st Division beachhead as well. American casualties were approximately 50 killed and over 100 wounded. Piazza Ridge saved the Sicilian invasion. Gavin was awarded his first Distinguished Service Cross. He suffered a mortar fragment wound to the leg, but dismissed it as unworthy of a Purple Heart. I keep coming back to this battle because it established the template for everything that followed. A young colonel with no heavy weapons, no armor, and a collection of whoever he could grab, holding critical ground against a panzer division through sheer refusal to quit. That was the 82nd Airborne's identity. Not just bravery, but calculated stubbornness backed by improvisation. That was Gavin's entire philosophy of war, forged at Piazza Ridge and repeated at every engagement after. When the Salerno beachhead teetered on collapse 4 days into the invasion in September 1943, General Mark Clark called on the 82nd. His message to Ridgway was 3 words: "This is a must." Clark personally ordered every anti-aircraft battery to hold fire. A direct and bitter lesson from Sicily. On the night of September 13th, Tucker's 504th jumped onto the beachhead near Pestum, guided by oil drums filled with gasoline-soaked sand ignited at 50-yard intervals. The next night, Gavin's 505th followed. Both drops were precise. A complete transformation from the chaos over Sicily. Within 24 hours, 2 parachute regiments had stabilized the faltering beachhead. The 82nd pushed forward and entered Naples on October 1st, 1943, the first major European city liberated by the Allies. Major Ed Cannonball Krause of the 505th raised the American flag over the Naples post office. The 504th remained in Italy for Anzio, where it earned one of the most famous nicknames in military history. A diary found on a dead German officer of the 1st Parachute Division read, "American parachutists, devils in baggy pants, are less than 100 meters from my outpost line. I cannot sleep at night. They pop up from nowhere, and we never know when or how they will strike next. Seems like the black-hearted devils are everywhere. This is the part the official histories gloss over, not the combat, the politics." On December 9th, 1943, Gavin was promoted to brigadier general at age 36. 6 months later, on the night of June 5th, 1944, he jumped into Normandy as the 82nd's assistant division commander under Major General Matthew Ridgway. He was 37 years old. He took off from RAF Cottesmore with the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment and was the first man out of his aircraft at approximately 2:15 in the morning on June 6, 1944. The Normandy drop was worse than Sicily. Only the veteran 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment landed near its assigned zone, with roughly 75% of sticks within a mile. The 507th had the worst drop of any regiment on D-Day. Only 3 sticks landed near the drop zone, and 180 paratroopers were dropped more than 20 kilometers away, near the village of Grain, where they would fight a doomed last stand against an entire German division. Fully half the 508th was unavailable for hours. Many men drowned in the flooded Murderette River marshes, dragged under by equipment in as little as 2 feet of water. 60% of all heavy equipment, mortars, radios, demolition charges, and ammunition resupply was lost in scattered drops across the Norman countryside. After 24 hours, only about 2,000 of the 82nd's paratroopers were under division control, roughly 1/3 of the force that had jumped. Gavin landed in a pasture near the Murderette, far from his drop zone. By 4 in the morning, he had assembled about 200 men and led them south along a railroad embankment. He found another 300 near Lafayette. He split his forces, sending one group south to seize the Chef du Pont Bridge while keeping the rest at Lafayette. He spent D-Day walking back and forth between the 2 positions, a distance of several miles, organizing troops from different regiments who had never trained together and directing assaults under continuous fire. What followed at Lafayette Bridge was, according to the official history, probably the bloodiest small unit struggle in the experience of American arms. The stone bridge over the flooded Murderette connected to a 500-yard elevated causeway, the only solid crossing for miles. Without it, American forces from Utah Beach could not push west to cut off the Cottonton Peninsula. Elements of the 505th seized the East End on D-Day morning. A German counterattack hit at 4 in the afternoon. 3 captured French Renault tanks with 200 infantry, forcing American prisoners to walk ahead as human shields. Bazooka teams and a 57mm anti-tank gun destroyed all 3 tanks at point-blank range. For 3 days, the Americans clung to the East Bank under continuous artillery and mortar fire. Company A of the 505th's 1st Platoon was reduced to 15 men still fighting under Sergeant William Owens. Casualties mounted hourly. The bridge changed hands. Americans held on. On June 9th, Ridgway told Gavin, "You are in charge. We attack at 0930. After a 15-minute artillery barrage, the 3rd Battalion of the 325th Glider Infantry Regiment charged across the 500-yard causeway, single file, on an elevated road barely wide enough for a vehicle, fully exposed to interlocking machine gun fire, mortars, and artillery from 3 directions. There was no cover. Men fell, and the men behind them stepped over the bodies and kept going. Private First Class Charles de Glopper of the 325th performed a suicidal covering action. He walked out onto the road in full view of every German weapon, stood upright, and sprayed the enemy positions with his Browning automatic rifle until he was cut down. He bought his platoon enough time to reach the West Bank. He received the 82nd Airborne Division's 1st Medal of Honor of the war. A soldier who witnessed the Lafayette assault recalled that the most memorable sight that day was Ridgway, Gavin, and Maloney, standing right there where it was the hottest. Every soldier who hit that causeway saw every general officer and the regimental and battalion commanders right there. That was Gavin's leadership in a single image, standing where the fire was worst. Total casualties at Lafayette over 4 days of fighting. Approximately 60 killed and 529 wounded, captured, or missing. Some companies lost more than half their strength in the June 9th assault alone. The 82nd fought in Normandy for 33 consecutive days. No relief, no replacements, no rotation. Total Normandy casualties: 5,245 killed, wounded, or missing. A 46% casualty rate. On D-Day alone, 1,259 casualties. Ridgway's after-action report stated it with the kind of plainness that needs no embellishment. 33 days of action without relief, without replacements. Every mission accomplished. No ground gained was ever relinquished. This is the part most histories skip. While the 101st Airborne gets the documentary treatment and the cultural real estate, the 82nd was in combat a full year before the Screaming Eagles ever jumped. It made 4 combat jumps to the 101st's 2. It logged 422 days of combat across 7 campaigns. It took higher total casualties, but it never had its Band of Brothers moment in popular culture. In my view, that is partly because Gavin himself was not interested in self-promotion after the war. He was interested in ideas. He wrote books about missile defense and nuclear strategy, while Maxwell Taylor wrote memoirs. The cameras found one story, the record tells another. When Ridgway moved up to command the 18th Airborne Corps in August 1944, he recommended Gavin as his successor. Gavin took command of the 82nd Airborne Division at age 37. He was promoted to temporary Major General on October 20th, still 37, making him the youngest Major General to command an American division since George Armstrong Custer in the Civil War. To put that in context, most American division commanders in World War II were in their late 40s to mid-50s. Maxwell Taylor, commanding the 101st Airborne, was 42. Raymond Barton of the 4th Infantry Division was 54. Terry Allen of the 1st Infantry Division was 54. Norman Cota, the legendary Assistant Division Commander of the 29th Infantry Division on Omaha Beach, was 51. Gavin was a full decade younger than nearly every peer in a comparable position. His first test as division commander was Market Garden, and it was the most controversial action of his career. The 82nd drew the most complex mission of the entire operation. Capture the Grave Bridge over the Maas, seize canal bridges over the Maas-Wall Canal, take the massive Nijmegen Bridge over the Wall River, one of the longest bridges in Europe, and hold the Groesbeek Heights, the dominant terrain overlooking all of it, against potential counterattacks from the Reichswald forest to the east. 4 major objectives spread across miles of Dutch countryside. Gavin made his 4th combat jump on September 17, 1944, and fractured 2 vertebrae in his spine on landing. He did not report or treat the injury for nearly 2 months. He fought the entire campaign with a broken back. The Grave Bridge and 1 canal bridge were captured intact on D-Day. The Groesbeek Heights were secured. But the Nijmegen Bridge was not taken on the first day, and that is the decision that will follow Gavin forever. Here is the honest assessment. Gavin prioritized holding the Groesbeek Heights over rushing the Nijmegen Bridge. His reasoning was defensible. Intelligence reported up to 1,000 German tanks potentially staged in the Reichswald. The Heights dominated the entire operational area, and losing them meant losing everything. Landing zones for the next day's reinforcements had to be secured, or the division would receive no resupply, no glider artillery, and no additional troops. Lieutenant General Frederick Browning, commanding the 1st Airborne Corps, had given Gavin priorities that listed the Heights first and the Wall Bridge last. The threat proved real. On September 18th, Germans overran Drop Zone T and threatened Drop Zone N. The 508th barely retook them before the 2nd lift arrived. If those zones had been lost, the 82nd would have been stranded without reinforcement, but critics have a point too. The Nijmegen Bridge was virtually undefended for hours on D-Day. A swift coup de main by even a single battalion could have taken it. By the time the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment moved toward it in late afternoon, after a 7-hour delay compounded by miscommunication with its commander Colonel Lindquist, SS reinforcements had crossed from Arnhem and fortified the approaches. The 36-hour delay in capturing the bridge fatally slowed 30 Corps' advance toward Arnhem, where the British 1st Airborne Division was being destroyed. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost of the British 2nd Parachute Battalion, who held the north end of the Arnhem Bridge with dwindling forces, later wrote that the worst mistake of the plan was the failure to prioritize capturing the Nijmegen Bridge. Gavin himself expressed regret to associates, saying he wished he had sent Tucker's battle-hardened 504th instead of the 508th. In my view, Gavin made a defensible but imperfect decision under competing pressures and incomplete intelligence. Browning's orders gave him cover. The drop zone threat validated his concern, but the delay at Nijmegen cost irreplaceable hours. Market Garden was a bad plan given to good divisions, and Gavin made the best of a deeply flawed operation. His one mistake does not erase what his men did next, because what came next was one of the most extraordinary acts of courage in the entire war. After 2 days of failed frontal attacks on the fortified bridge approaches, Gavin ordered an assault crossing of the 400-yard-wide Wall River in broad daylight. Major Julian Cook, 27 years old, led the 3rd Battalion of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment in 26 collapsible canvas boats. Each boat carried 10 paratroopers and 3 combat engineers paddling with 8 canoe paddles. Some men used rifle butts. Others used their helmets. A smokescreen was laid at 14:55 hours. The first wave launched 2 minutes later under direct fire from machine guns, 20mm flak cannons, mortars, and artillery positioned on the far bank and the bridge itself. Cook heard his lieutenants rowing to the rhythm of the rosary. More than half of the 260 troops in the first wave were killed or wounded during the crossing. Only about half the boats made it to the far bank. Many sank. Men drowned in the wall, weighted down by equipment. The survivors clawed ashore, stormed German positions with bayonets and grenades, and fought 4,000 yards north to capture the far end of the Nijmegen Bridge from behind. War correspondent Bill Downs of CBS compared the action in magnificence and courage with Guam, Tarawa, and Omaha Beach. 48 paratroopers were killed in the crossing alone. The soldiers called it Little Omaha, and then British 30 Corps tanks, having finally crossed the captured bridge, stopped for the night. They did not push to Arnhem, 11 miles away. 504th veteran Gene Metcalf summed up the fury decades later. The British were supposed to close the gap, but they stopped. 82nd Airborne casualties during Market Garden. 1,432 killed, wounded, and missing in 9 days. After the operation, British Lieutenant General Miles Dempsey, commanding the Second Army, called the 82nd the finest division in the world today. The numbers tell the rest of the story. When the German Ardennes offensive struck on December 16, 1944, Gavin was at dinner in Sicily, France. The 82nd was supposed to be resting. With Ridgway stranded in England by weather, Gavin temporarily commanded the entire 18th Airborne Corps. He made the critical decision that shaped the American response. The 82nd to Werbemont on the northern shoulder of the Bulge, facing the main SS Panzer thrust, the 101st to Bastogne. The 82nd arguably drew the harder assignment. Bastogne got the press. But the northern shoulder is where the 6th SS Panzer Army, including the feared Kampfgruppe Piper of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, was trying to break through to the Meuse River crossings. Lead elements of the 82nd arrived in Werbemont roughly 24 hours after alert. Having traveled over 100 miles by truck through rain and fog, they deployed across a 25-mile front in freezing temperatures with winter gear they did not have. Conditions were savage. Temperatures near 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Heavy snow, blizzards that reduced visibility to yards. Jump boots, designed for warm weather drops, allowed no room for extra socks. Men stuffed straw into their boots and wrapped their feet in burlap sacks. Frostbite was epidemic. There was no hot food for days. The division had just spent 2 months in continuous combat during Market Garden and its aftermath in Holland. Many of these men had not been home since 1943. They had fought in Sicily, in Italy, in Normandy, in Holland. And now they were in the Ardennes in December in summer uniforms with no winter overcoats, no overshoes, and no white camouflage. Key engagements included fierce house-to-house combat at Chenot against Piper's men, the defense of 8,000 yards of Salm River line at Trois Ponts, and covering the withdrawal of encircled American armor from the St. Vith pocket. At Trois Ponts, the 82nd held the river line for days against repeated attacks by elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division, the same unit responsible for the Malmedy massacre of American prisoners just days earlier. The paratroopers knew exactly who they were fighting. There was no quarter asked and little given. During the Bulge, Gavin crawled from foxhole to foxhole, checking on soldiers in sub-zero temperatures. He refused to command from a heated building while his men froze in holes. He wrote to his daughter Barbara that he had always written to the family of every boy who was a fatality. So by then, he had an awful heap of letters to write. That sentence, written in the middle of the worst winter fighting of the war, tells you everything about who this man was. He was not writing memos. He was not positioning himself for promotion. He was writing condolence letters to mothers and fathers, one at a time, in his own hand. On January 3rd, 1945, the 82nd launched its counterattack. They overran the 62nd Volksgrenadier Division and 9th SS Panzer Division positions, capturing 2,400 prisoners on the first day alone. The 551st Parachute Infantry Battalion, attached to the 82nd for the operation, was virtually destroyed. Of 826 men who entered the Ardennes, only 110 came out. The unit was never reconstituted. This is an underexplored part of Gavin's command record. Author Gregory Orfalea has argued that Gavin sent the 551st into near-suicidal attacks and subsequently minimized their destruction. I think that criticism deserves more attention than it has received. 82nd Bulge casualties, 1,824 total, 281 killed, 1,290 wounded, 253 missing. The 504th earned its second Presidential Unit citation, the first such citation won by any American unit in the Battle of the Bulge. The 82nd then crashed through the Siegfried Line in the Rhineland campaign and advanced deep into Germany. The fighting in the Rhineland was different from anything the division had done before. This was not airborne warfare. This was conventional ground combat, grinding through fortified positions, clearing pillboxes, crossing rivers under fire. And the 82nd did it as well as any infantry division in the theater, which tells you something important about what Gavin had built. The 82nd was not just an elite airborne unit. It was an elite fighting unit, period. It could do anything the Army asked, in any configuration, under any conditions. The final weeks of the war became a race. On May 2nd, 1945, the division covered 36 miles in a single day. driving deep into Mecklenburg. Lieutenant General Kurt von Tippelskirch's 21st German Army, over 150,000 men, surrendered to the 82nd. It was one of the largest mass surrenders in the European theater. Von Tippelskirch arrived at Gavin's command post, saw a slim young officer in a faded jumpsuit with an M1 rifle slung over his shoulder, and said he was too young and did not look like a general. It took only a moment to change his mind. That same day, the division liberated Wöblin concentration camp near Ludwigslust. What the paratroopers found there was beyond anything combat had prepared them for. Approximately 1,000 inmates were found dead, their bodies stacked in open pits or scattered across the compound. Survivors were skeletal, weighing as little as 60 or 70 pounds. Some had resorted to cannibalism. The division chaplain, George Wood, noted that these men of Holland, Russia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and France had simply been allowed to starve to death. There were no gas chambers at Wöblin, no crematoria, just starvation. Gavin's response was immediate and uncompromising. He ordered the townspeople of Ludwigslust to visit the camp and see what had been done in their name. He ordered them to dig graves and bury the dead with their own hands. A funeral was held on the town square for 200 victims, attended by captured German generals who were forced to stand in the front row and watch. Gavin had the bodies exhumed from mass graves and reburied in individual plots in the town's public gardens, so that the citizens of Ludwigslust would have to walk past them every day. That was not policy, that was Gavin. After VE Day, the 82nd was selected for Berlin occupation duty, the ultimate mark of prestige. General George Patton, reviewing the 82nd's honor guard, declared that in all his years in the Army, in all the honor guards he had ever seen, the 82nd's was undoubtedly the best. That earned the division its enduring nickname, America's Guard of Honor. Let me lay out the full picture in hard numbers, because the numbers are what separate legend from record. 422 days of combat, the fourth most of 73 American divisions in the European theater. 7 campaigns, 4 combat jumps, twice as many as any other American airborne division, 9,073 battle casualties, including 1,992 killed in action, roughly 200,000 German prisoners taken, 7 major river crossings under fire, 4 Medals of Honor, 37 Distinguished Service Crosses, 898 Silver Stars, 1,894 Bronze Stars, 15 Distinguished Unit Citations, and the defining statistic: no ground gained was ever relinquished. Not at Piazza Ridge, not at La Fière, not at Nijmegen, not on the northern shoulder of the Bulge, not once in 422 days. Before Sicily, one of Gavin's troopers declared that they would follow him straight to hell if he asked them, and plant their color over Satan's command post ahead of schedule. That was not sarcasm. That was how the 82nd's men felt about the youngest division commander in the American Army. The man who was first out the door, who carried a Garand, who jumped with a broken back at Market Garden and never told anyone, who stood in the open at La Fière when every other sane person was in a hole. What made that loyalty different from normal military obedience was the way Gavin earned it. Most division commanders in the ETO led from a command post. They studied maps, issued orders through staff officers, and visited the front when conditions allowed. This was not incompetence. It was doctrine. A major general's job was to coordinate thousands of men across miles of front. Getting yourself killed in a foxhole helped nobody. And for conventional infantry divisions, that approach worked. Gavin rejected it entirely. His philosophy, laid out clearly in his own writings, was that a commander must be where the crisis is, not behind it, not reading about it on a situation map, at it, in person, with a weapon in his hands. He believed that soldiers fought harder when they could see their general sharing the danger, and he believed that a commander who was physically present at the critical point made better decisions than one who was reading reports from 3 miles back. According to Phil Nordyke in All American All the Way, this was not recklessness. Gavin was precise about where he went and when. He moved to the point of decision, the place where the battle would be won or lost, and he stayed there until the situation was resolved. At Piazza Ridge, that meant standing on a hilltop with no armor support against 17 Tiger tanks. At La Fière, that meant walking back and forth across open ground between 2 positions under continuous mortar fire. At Market Garden, that meant jumping with a broken back and commanding a division for 2 months without mentioning it. The risk was real. Gavin was wounded multiple times, though he consistently refused to report minor injuries. He carried a Garand not just as a symbol, but because he used it. In Holland, a veteran recalled, Gavin jumped into a foxhole and took shots at the Germans, explaining he needed to keep his shooting eye up to par. At one point during the Bulge, he personally directed fire from a position so exposed that his aide begged him to move. He stayed. I believe this is the core of why the 82nd became what it became. Gavin did not just train hard men. He created a culture where leadership meant going first into danger. Officers carried the heavy rifle. Officers jumped first. Officers ate last. And the commanding general, the man with 2 stars on his helmet, was as likely to be found in a foxhole as in a command post. That culture produced a division that never gave ground, because the men in the foxholes knew that their general was not asking them to do anything he would not do himself. They had watched him do it. At Piazza Ridge and La Fière and Nijmegen and the Ardennes. Every single time. There is one more thing worth knowing about this man. In December 1947, 8 months before President Truman signed Executive Order 9981 desegregating the military, Gavin ordered the all-black 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion, known as the Triple Nickels, integrated into the 82nd Airborne Division. Colonel Bradley Biggs called Gavin the most colorblind Army officer in the entire military. After the war, Gavin became the youngest lieutenant general since the Civil War. He served as Deputy Chief of Staff for Research and Development, pioneering helicopter air assault tactics that would define the Vietnam War a decade later. He pushed hard for the Army to invest in missile technology and tactical nuclear delivery systems at a time when most of the brass still thought in terms of World War II-era formations. He was, as he had always been, ahead of everyone else in the room, but in January 1958, at the pinnacle of his career, with a 4th star and the Army Chief of Staff position within reach, he resigned. The Eisenhower administration's New Look policy, favoring massive nuclear retaliation over conventional forces, was a doctrine Gavin believed would lead to catastrophe. He wrote that strategic nuclear weapons served no sane purpose other than causing hundreds of millions of deaths. He argued that the United States needed flexible conventional forces capable of fighting limited wars. Not a single button that ended civilization. He was right. The next decade proved it. Vietnam was exactly the kind of war the New Look was incapable of fighting. The Army Quartermaster Museum put his choice plainly. If he, in all good conscience, disagreed with policy, he had only 2 honorable choices: resign or support. General Gavin honorably chose the former. I think the resignation is the final proof of who Gavin really was. He did not play politics. He did not trim his views to keep his career alive. He had fought his way from an orphanage to the command of the most decorated division in the American Army, and when the system demanded that he endorse a strategy he believed was insane, he walked away, at 51 years old, with everything still ahead of him. Most men in that position would have kept their mouths shut, taken the 4th star, and written a critical memoir 20 years later. Gavin could not do that. He was the same man who had refused to carry a carbine when his soldiers carried Garands, the same man who jumped first. The principle was the same at every level. If you would not do it yourself, you had no right to ask anyone else to do it. And if that pattern sounds familiar, if you have watched someone walk away from a career because they would not pretend to believe in a strategy they knew was wrong, you know this is not just a World War II story. It is a story about what happens when competence meets principle in a system that rewards neither. President Kennedy appointed him ambassador to France in 1961. He is credited with suggesting the idea for the Peace Corps during the 1960 campaign. He later became one of the most visible former military critics of the Vietnam War, testifying before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He died on February 23, 1990, at age 82, of complications from Parkinson's disease. He is buried at West Point Cemetery. His gravestone features a master parachutist badge with 4 combat jump stars. According to T. Michael Booth and Duncan Spencer in Paratrooper, the definitive biography, Gavin's story is ultimately about what one person can build when the system has no choice but to let competence lead. The Army did not plan to put a 37-year-old orphan from a coal town in charge of its most elite division. The war demanded it. And for 422 days, from Sicily to Berlin, James Gavin proved that the system's reluctance was the only thing that had ever been wrong. He was born without a name his parents intended to keep. He left school at 14. He ran away at 17. He educated himself at 4:30 in the morning in a bathroom because it was the only room with enough light. He wrote the Army's first manual on airborne warfare, then jumped into combat 4 times to prove every page of it.